A divorced billionaire's 7-year-old son discovers an old diary at a homeless shelter and takes it to his dad. It's his ex-wife's, and he freezes in shock when he opens it. Hey there. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Support the channel, then just sit back, relax, and enjoy. It was one of those Saturdays that Malcolm Gates typically steered clear of, just too many. There are folks around, bright fluorescent lights everywhere, and that odd smell of canned green beans just hanging in the air. So, Jamie was really pushing that his class was working on a unit about community service, and every student had to volunteer somewhere. And Jamie picked the downtown shelter because they have a lost and found, he said with a shrug, almost like he was hoping to find some treasure. Malcolm had offered to write instead of a generous donation, maybe we could sponsor a hot meal drive, but Jamie had refused. We really need to go in person, Dad. It's genuine volunteering. And you said you'd be more involved. So, there was Malcolm, standing behind this long metal table, serving up some beef stew into bowls. Dented bowls, a plastic apron on. And a man with an expression that says he's regretting all his life choices, steam fogging up his glasses perched on his nose, the sleeves of his cashmere sweater rolled up to his elbows. And he had already dropped a ladle in the pot twice, and the volunteer coordinator, who was quite stout, was watching. A woman named Carol, who handled her authority like a soup ladle, had kindly suggested that he take a step back and let. Jamie had disappeared around the corner, happily pushing along with another volunteer. Malcolm pushed the cart of juice boxes like he owned the place, but he couldn't recall the last time he had ventured this far out of his. It was likely some investor pitch from about 10 years back, when he still had something to prove before the IPO. The Forbes list before the divorce was like watching a slow-motion car crash unfold in every media outlet that just couldn't get enough of it. What a fall from grace. Now he's just a guy in an apron, sweating through his. Jamie was dealing with an expensive undershirt and trying to keep his balance while an elderly man asked for crackers, even though he didn't have any teeth. It was quite the scene. An hour later, Carol came back, proudly holding a bent clipboard and waving it in her father's face. She said, "I can help in the back. Can I help organize the books in the room, Dad, please?" "Sure," Malcolm replied. "Not thinking too much about it," she said. "Just stay where people can see you." Jamie nodded and took off. Already halfway down the hall, Malcolm let out a sigh, wiped his forehead with a napkin, and attempted to scrape some stew off his shoe. He glanced at his watch. Only 40 minutes had passed. He had about 40 minutes left to get through public service without accidentally setting anything on fire, and he was pretty sure he could manage that. Meanwhile, Jamie strolled through a maze filled with folding chairs and paper donation bins. There were overfilled bookshelves piled up against a cinder block wall, and a dusty box labeled paperbacks was maybe half open. And next to it, under a stack of worn encyclopedias, he spotted something unusual. He pulled free a small leather-bound book. Worn and warped, but still intact. It had a faded red ribbon is sticking out, and there's a folded corner on a page near the back of the cover. It didn't have a title, but there were these faint pen drawings scattered all over it, like stars in a coffee cup. Jamie turned it over in his hands, curious about the little hearts in the corners. He brought it back to the front, cradling it like it was something precious. "Dad," he said, tugging on. Malcolm's sleeve says, "Look what I found. It's got hearts drawn on it. Maybe it's a love thing." Malcolm was elbow-deep in soggy napkins at the trash station, glancing around. Kind of half listening, I asked, "What is it?" "A diary. I believe it was in a box." "In the back? Can I keep it?" Malcolm reached for the book, not really interested. His hands were damp, so he held it carefully. The leather was cracked and soft at the corners, and there was something about those little hearts that felt oddly familiar to him. I opened it to the first page, and the handwriting was small, slanted, and sharp. He stopped, doodling a flower in the margin while the loops on the GS dragged on a bit too long. Breathing, it seemed impossible, right? But somehow, his body was aware of it even before his mind caught up. That handwriting, it wasn't just familiar, it was definitely hers, with that looping script. The little punctuation marks and how she curled her lowercase c. He had noticed this. Handwriting on sticky notes, left on bathroom mirrors, in the margins of old cookbooks. On love letters folded into. He found something in his coat pockets that he hadn't thought about in ages. Honestly, he hadn't wanted to, But there it was. He flipped ahead, scanning for context, and noticed it was Elena's handwriting on a page nearby. The middle had a quick entry, no date, just a single paragraph that seemed to be written in a rush. It talked about sleepless nights. There was a boy with dark curls, someone called Jay. Malcolm's hands started to shake, Jamie noticed. He stared up at him. Are you okay, Malcolm? He shut the diary quickly, maybe too quickly. Yeah. I just found out this belonged to someone I knew a long time ago, like A. My friend hesitated, something like that. Jamie blinked, clearly not buying it. Can I? I think I should hang on to it for now. Even though Jamie frowned. He was just a bit distracted by a tray of cookies being passed around nearby. All right, but if it's a love story, you've got to read it to me later. Deal? Malcolm said. They wrapped up their shift quietly, with a lot less chaos than that first hour. Malcolm let Carol handle the stew duty while he used the rest of the time to help bag canned goods. His thoughts, though, were wandering far away. He couldn't help but keep replaying that handwriting in his mind, the rhythm of it, the way she. I used to write him silly notes on receipts and leave them in his coat pockets. He hadn't seen Elena in over a. It's been a year since the divorce hearings wrapped up, and she's moved overseas. Or so they say. They were working with a charity, but they hadn't talked since the final signature. That diary, though, it was here, and it was recent. While Jamie dozed off on the couch. Lost in cartoons, Malcolm found himself in the kitchen, flipping open the diary once more. This time, he kicked things off from the start. The first entry didn't have a date, but it felt pretty recent. The ink was still bold, and the writing had a powerful presence. It felt vulnerable and raw. It wasn't the type of journal someone kept just for kicks. It was all about survival, she wrote. She talked about being alone and how everything seemed to fall apart after the marriage ended. She didn't blame him, not directly. She mentioned disappearing, waking up in unfamiliar places, and wandering the city without a destination. She never brought up the last name, never mentioned Malcolm or Jamie, but she did. She didn't need to explain how much Jay, the boy who always made her smile, meant to her. Even in his memory, he discovered a pressed flower tucked between two pages, a daisy dry and crumbling on the page beside it. She had written some. There were days when I think I spotted him on Main Street. I can't help but wonder if he'd remember me if I waved. Probably not. I don't even recognize myself most mornings. Malcolm leaned in. He settled back in his chair, and the kitchen was dark now, except for the light above the stove. The diary was lying open on the table, and he just kept staring at it, hoping it might give him some answers. But all he had were questions. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she reached out? Was she still out there? Living in a bit of a shadow? Was she still around? He took a quick look over there. In the living room, Jamie had kicked off his socks and was half curled up in a blanket. Mouth open, breathing evenly. It was just A. The kid has no clue that he might have just stumbled upon the missing piece of a story that neither of them had finished. Malcolm was up before Jamie the next morning, sitting at the kitchen. A table with the diary spread open next to a mostly untouched cup of coffee. He hadn't planned on staying up reading it. But here we are. The night before, but once he began flipping through the pages, it was like stopping became totally out of the question. Found himself on the couch, leaning over it as if it had the answers to questions he hadn't even thought about asking in ages. Elena slipped out, leaving a calm moment before Jamie stirred. He found himself reading through the same pages again. Once more, this time at a slower pace, the handwriting, clearly hers, became more relaxed and free-flowing. He hurried along. And the further he went, the more he noticed that the entries weren't dated regularly, just scattered timestamps here and there from 6 months ago. So, there were 5, then 3. And one page didn't have a date at all, just a smear of ink where it was supposed to be. It seemed like she had started crying right in the middle of her sentence. She never called herself by name and didn't bring him up at all. Jamie was direct, but her voice came through in every line she wrote about the hotel. Lobbies and waiting rooms filled with the heavy silence of losing her sense of direction. Not just in the city, but in. Malcolm noticed he was slowing down on one paragraph where she talked about watching a mother and child walking together in the rain. She said it felt like being a ghost, like someone who used to fit into a world that had moved on without her. Then, near the bottom of the page, she'd scrolled just a single line that had him gripping the edge of the table. I miss being someone's first thought in the morning. In the morning, it just didn't feel like the Elena he remembered, the sharp-witted, fiercely independent woman who would always stand her ground in an argument. for sport and could easily handle a room full of VCs without even needing to raise her voice. But then again, maybe this had always been lurking beneath the surface. Perhaps he'd just been too distracted, too caught up in. As he built his company, he couldn't help but notice her soft edges starting to fray. She used to joke about it, saying that I used to treat work like a second wife, and he laughed about it. Back then, it didn't seem funny at all. So, Jamie wandered into the kitchen, hair all messy and dragging along his stuffed frog. "Are we having pancakes?" Malcolm shut the diary with one hand, slipping it under the newspaper like a kid trying to hide something. "Huh? Yeah, totally." Jamie yawned and climbed onto the stool, watching his dad fumble through the kitchen. Malcolm cracked in. Jamie cracked the egg with a bit too much force, sending shell bits flying across the counter, but he didn't seem to notice afterward. While having breakfast, Jamie wandered off to watch cartoons, and Malcolm quietly slipped upstairs with the diary tucked under his arm. He locked the bedroom door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed, flipping ahead to the middle. The entries were, "It's a bit scattered here, just a few lines and then some gaps." One page, "I simply read today. I walked. It took me 3 hours just to feel like I was making some progress." He read another one. "And they think I'm normal here, but honestly, I mostly don't feel that way. So, I was chatting with this girl named Tamika, and she asked me if I was a writer. I told her no, but it felt like a lie." He could almost hear her voice saying it, with that dry humor of hers. She was careful about holding things back until she felt someone was really listening. Especially halfway through the journal, Malcolm slowly unfolded a torn photo that was pressed between 2 pages. The top half of it was missing, but he could still recognize the bottom corner of his shirt, Jamie's striped socks, and a bit of their old brown couch. It looked like a picture that Elena had probably torn in half. So he flipped it over to check the back. It was a little ink sketch of a smiling boy with a balloon, no doubt about it, Jamie. There was no way to brush this off now. This wasn't just someone who happened to write like her. It was her diary sheet. Maybe she was still here that night after Jamie had left. Malcolm was sitting by himself in the den, flipping to the back of the journal. There were just a few pages left, and they were mostly blank. So there was this one entry that was dated 6 months ago, which was after the divorce was finalized. Long after she was supposed to have moved abroad, "I think I spotted him on Main Street. He ducked into a laundromat, and before he turned around, I don't think he noticed. Part of me wanted to just run out and wave, but I felt like a totally different person. I think I really am a different person. Maybe it's better this way." I just stood there for a while, watching the traffic. If only he realized I was here. Malcolm gently closed the journal and set it down carefully. His hands were steady now, but there was something in his chest that felt a bit off-kilter. It was like a picture frame that was tilted just enough to annoy you if you stared at it for too long. He tried to remember what happened 6 months ago. If he had been downtown on Main Street, his office was probably nearby, right? He ran over there, into people all the time. If she had really been standing across the street, did he just not look up and see her? She leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. It just didn't make sense. She mentioned that they were supposed to split things fairly, but it seemed like money was a factor. So she's thinking about starting a nonprofit overseas focused on women's education. But can you imagine if she ended up here at this shelter, just writing? These words meant that something had really gone off track. He just hadn't noticed it, or maybe he just didn't want to face it. In the days that followed, Malcolm kept the diary close, tucked away in his briefcase. He kept it tucked under his pillow at night and would sneak in a few pages at the office when no one was around. On the drive home, he'd replay bits of it in his mind. Some sentences were running through his mind, almost like a thread had been pulled, and now it was like everything was happening in slow motion, and he began asking Jamie questions at the strangest moments. "Hey, do you remember what Mommy used to have for breakfast?" Jamie looked up from his coloring book and said, "Peanut butter toast." Sometimes. Malcolm would nod as if he was just curious about putting cinnamon on it. When it comes to her favorite song, Jamie scrunched his nose. "You know, the one about the moon she'd mentioned." When I was sick, he began to notice other things as well, like the photos of Elena that he hadn't really looked at before. Years later, she still remembers the painting she bought from a street vendor during their honeymoon. Jamie said some words that really reminded him of her one night when Malcolm was standing in the doorway of Jamie's room, and I watched him sleep, and the house was so quiet. For a moment, I could almost picture Elena there with us, just standing next to him, not like the version you see in the magazine headlines or anything like that. Woman from the diary. But the Elena he first met before everything got chaotic and the next morning, Malcolm called the shelter to see if they had any records of recent guests. The woman he spoke to. They were polite but firm on the line, explaining that they couldn't share any information due to privacy reasons. Even with all the information, he still couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't gone far. The diary felt too fresh, the details too vivid. She thought that if she had spotted him on Main Street once, maybe she'd run into him again. He pulled up a map of the area and circled every shelter, halfway house, or drop-in center within 5 miles. Then, he marked the spot where Leo's Cafe is located. The little place they had sought shelter during a thunderstorm on their first date, drenched and laughing over cheap pastries from a place that had closed years ago. But he still remembered the exact address from that night when he pulled out the diary again, flipping to the sketch of Jamie, holding a balloon. He stared at it for a long time before closing the book and saying quietly to the room, "I'm going to." Malcolm didn't mention the diary to anyone, not even his assistant, his lawyer, not even the therapist he'd been seeing on and off since the divorce, the one who kept reminding him to live. For the past week, it felt like the only present he could really be in was one filled with old haunts and coffee, stained journal pages, and a knot in his stomach that just wouldn't go away since that night he read that line about. Every chance he got, he would read through the diary again on Main Street. It was pretty worn out. The pages were already soft from being turned so often. He tried not to memorize it, but the words stuck with him regardless. He began with the basics. Elena's last known phone number was no longer in service. Her email bounced back, and social media didn't offer anything. Her old accounts had nothing to show. Malcolm had gone dormant before the divorce, and now he found himself scrolling through old tagged photos, reminiscing and hoping for something. At one point, he even gave facial recognition software a shot, something his company had developed for security in the past. Clients are sharing a few of her old profile pictures and checking them against some recent surveillance footage. It didn't really give me anything useful from the public transportation hubs. But he felt like the process was really productive, which was enough to keep him motivated. So he started dropping by shelters. So, at first, it was just the one where Jamie found the diary. And then he began to expand, reaching out into nearby districts, and he brought food along. He asked gentle questions about the toiletries and kept a copy of Elena's high school stuff. He kept a graduation photo folded in his wallet, just in case someone ever needed a reference. He only mentioned her name if someone really pushed him. Otherwise, he'd just say he was looking for someone. She could have passed through here about 6 months back, with slim brown hair and in her early 40s. She might have carried notebooks sometimes. And people would nod like they understood. They got it. Sometimes they didn't even bother to look up to make the whole thing feel less obvious. It's kind of odd how he started volunteering for real. He'd show up early and stay late. I brought some muffins one day, the store-bought kind that were a bit too sweet. I spent the morning serving them up with paper cups of tea while Jamie watched. Later that afternoon, someone from across the room narrowed his eyes at him suspiciously. As they were stuck in traffic, Jamie turned and asked, "Are you okay?" "Sure, you're putting on a show." Malcolm thought it was a bit weird. He reached for the temperature dial, just trying something new. He figured it might be good to give it a shot. Back, Jamie didn't say a word. He just shifted his focus to the window. The next morning, Malcolm noticed that his diary was missing from his briefcase, and at first, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He rushed through the house, then suddenly recalled that Jamie had needed his backpack from the office and had come in to grab it. Malcolm stormed up to Jamie's room, ready to give him a piece of his mind, but he paused when he noticed his son curled up on the rug, flipping through the pages as if it were a comic book. The look on his face didn't have that mischievous look. It was all about focus. Malcolm didn't say a word. He just backed out of the room and quietly shut the door behind him. Jamie picked up the diary and started reading. He read it cover to cover twice, and while he didn't get everything, some of the words felt a bit too heavy and adult for him. But he kept at it, feeling the sadness and loneliness, the way his mom talked about herself, like she was observing everything from beneath the surface of the water. The line that really stuck with him came towards the end. "If anyone finds this, please look." So, remember that time we got caught in the rain? Jamie was a bit confused about what it meant at first. but it definitely felt like it was something important. It was just like a clue from one of those adventure books he enjoyed. Before long, he knew he had to solve it. Jamie could tell that his dad was definitely up to something behind his back. Malcolm really didn't want to be left out this time. He had no clue what Jamie was planning. He found himself wandering through his own private maze of searching late one evening while he dropped off a box of old jackets at a shelter on the east side and hung around the check-in area, hoping someone would notice. You might remember the way he described a woman named Mara. I heard she wore a green scarf and carried herself like someone who didn't put up with any nonsense. Is she quiet? She asked him directly. Malcolm? She seemed effortlessly elegant, even without trying. He nodded and wrote a. He had a lot in one of those little black notebooks, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Yeah, Mara looked at him for a bit, almost like she was weighing whether to trust him or not. She hung around for a while. We don't. Let's keep records unless they ask us not to. I remember her, though. She never mentioned her name. Do you remember that night when she shared her cornbread? She had such a nice smile. It's been a few months since she left. Do you know where she is now? She just disappeared one day, no explanation. Then Malcolm pulled out a card, and I offered it to her. But if she comes back, she's just not the type to return, you know? Mara. I mentioned it softly, but if I run into her again, I'll keep you posted. Back at home, Jamie was. He was doing a bit of detective work himself, jotting down a list on a piece of graph paper of all the places he could remember visiting. He spent time with both his parents, especially when it rained, and he crossed out the museum. So, there's this grocery store with an indoor playground that is foam pits, and then out of nowhere, he remembered something from when he was little, maybe around 3 or 4. They got caught in a storm near a cafe and had to duck for cover. His mom had laughed and put napkins on her head, all while they were inside without umbrellas. She referred to it as romantic chaos. There were definitely green chairs, he was certain of that, and he spent 2 afternoons on his bike, chatting with shopkeepers about those big windows that fogged up when it rained. Block if they remembered the cafe. Most didn't, but one older man said, You mean? Leo's spot shut down a couple of years back. But hey, they had some great tea. Jamie mentioned it. Meanwhile, Malcolm was starting to wear himself out. He was canceling things left and right. Meetings, ignoring calls. Just drifting through the office when he actually decided to show up. His team thought he was dealing with some personal issues, and honestly, they weren't too far off. Every day, he struggled to find himself. Elena really emphasized the question that was bothering him. Why hadn't she called him? She knew his number, even if she had hated him. She wouldn't have stayed hidden from Jamie. That was the part he just couldn't understand. Forgive one night after a really long shift at another shelter where no one. Elena Malcolm came home and found Jamie snoozing at the kitchen table. A small flashlight is sitting next to a torn piece of paper, which happens to be a hand-drawn map. It's straightforward, with an arrow directing you to an X marked Leo's cafe right beside it. Jamie had jotted down, I think this is where she meant. Malcolm took a long look at the note before glancing over at. Jamie looked at the sleeping boy's face, gently brushed a crumb off his chin, and whispered, You might be right. The map Jamie had drawn had been sitting on Malcolm's desk for days, and he just didn't touch it. Even when I tried to move it to clean, it just stayed there. Like a quiet promise, a reminder that somehow, in all his obsessing, and he hadn't thought to ask the person who knew Elena in a different, quieter way. Jamie remembered things. Malcolm didn't realize that the boy's mind had picked up on details that often got lost in the chaos of adult life. Now that Malcolm, I saw it written in a child's handwriting. And it was clear, Leo's cafe, that place. There was this moment when everything felt so simple. He and Elena were laughing so hard that day. Completely soaked to the bone and just having fun stealing moments together. They were sitting there with sugar packets, waiting for their clothes to dry in patches. It was the moment of their first kiss. During their first real conversation, he couldn't help but think that she was unlike anyone he'd ever met. She didn't really care about his resume. She had no idea what he did for a living until their third date. She was just curious about him. Malcolm didn't hurry over to Leo's right away. He had other things to take care of first. He still held on to some doubt or fear. He wasn't quite sure which. What if it really was? She was thinking about that place, the one where she had left something behind, a sign, maybe a note. But what if it was all just a coincidence? What if she had already moved on, or even worse, vanished again while Malcolm hesitated? Jamie took. It all kicked off with a quiet chat over peanut butter sandwiches during lunch. Jamie leaned in. He was close to Caleb, his best friend since kindergarten, and laid out the mission. Caleb didn't need much convincing. He was all in. Always ready for an adventure, especially if it means sneaking around and discovering those secret spots Jamie showed him. The map showed the way to the exit and said they were going to go back over everything. They packed snacks and juice boxes for the spots that might have meant something to his mom. So, I found this notepad in Caleb's dad's old compass from a camping trip. It didn't work, but it seemed pretty official. They headed out one Saturday morning with 2 bikes, not really having a clear plan other than just following some clues. They found themselves at a little park with some rusty swings, and Jamie was pretty sure he remembered Elena reading there. They were sitting under a tree when they asked a guy who was feeding pigeons if he had ever spotted a woman writing in a notebook there. So, this guy was thinking that maybe one of the pigeons was actually his wife come back to life. Caleb took notes anyway. Next, they biked to a used bookstore where Jamie insisted they'd stop by. I once waited out a thunderstorm inside, and I asked the cashier if she remembered anyone named Elena. She looked a bit confused. Caleb jumped in and asked if anyone ever came in looking a bit down and reading poetry. The woman chuckled and gestured toward the self-help section. Jamie took a mental note that this could be a potential clue zone. We grabbed some fries at a corner diner and went over their findings, which were mostly filled with maybe answers and a lot of vagueness. Caleb threw out an interesting idea about the descriptions of women, suggesting that maybe they were seeing it all wrong. What if she didn't mean a place where it rained? What if she meant a place that felt like rain? Jamie stared at him for a long second. That's pretty interesting. While the guys were off on their own little detective adventure, Malcolm was behind the wheel. So, I was across town chasing down a new lead. One of the shelter coordinators brought up a woman who really seemed to fit Elena's description. He pulled up to a transitional housing center by the river, parking in the gravel lot behind the building. He took another look at the folded photo in his glove box, unsure of what he was hoping to find. Maybe Elena sitting on the steps, waiting for him, or perhaps someone with a letter she had left behind inside the woman at the desk let him sign in and said she would check if Ella was available. She was given something while in the building, and as the minutes ticked by, she eventually returned and pointed. As he walked toward the common room, he spotted her from behind, her brown hair tied up, looking familiar. With a gentle curve to her shoulders, she sat there with a paperback resting in her lap, flipping through the pages slowly. He took a step closer, his heart racing in his throat. Then she turned. It wasn't her. He left quietly, not trusting his feelings. He drove around for an hour, not really sure where he was headed, until his phone rang. The voice on the other end. On the other end was Jamie's school secretary. She sounded polite, but there was a bit of tension in her voice. Hey, Mr. Gates, sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to let you know that Jamie didn't show up this afternoon. We can't get in touch with his teacher. So Malcolm pulled over with his blinkers on. Wait, what? We thought you'd come early to pick him up, but his name wasn't signed. His friend Caleb is also missing. Malcolm hung up mid-sentence and dialed. Jamie tried calling, but there was no answer. He also reached out to Caleb's parents, but got nothing. By the time As I made my way back to the school, I noticed the sky was getting darker and the rain was beginning to come down. It came down quickly, making the streets slick and empty, just like a call from a city bus. The driver showed up an hour later, and 2 boys were spotted hanging out under the old kiosk. Malcolm didn't ask for any details. He just drove across from Main and 9th. I found them all huddled under a bus shelter, soaked and shivering, but thankfully unharmed. Jamie's bike, though, had a flat tire. Caleb's glasses were all fogged up. He looked up as the car pulled over, and there was Malcolm. He didn't even wait for the engine to stop before he jumped out, jogging through the puddles. He didn't yell, not even once. Jamie was trying to explain, but stumbled over his words. Malcolm knelt down and pulled him in close, water dripping from. I'm sorry, Jamie said. I just wanted to help. Malcolm took a long pause, breath still holding on to him. I know they sat under the shelter for a while. All 3 of them stood there as the rain poured down, and Caleb was busy trying to wring out his socks. Eventually, Malcolm turned to Jamie and asked, So, how long have you had the... Hey, have you thought about keeping a diary? Jamie fidgeted, saying, It's been like this since the night I read the map. Malcolm let out a tired sigh. So, Jamie was saying something about how you got that story from the cafe, right? It's funny how she used to share it with me. So there you are, caught in the rain on your first date. And she says that's when she realized you were going to turn her whole life upside down. Well, right? Malcolm laughed just once, and Jamie tilted his head. You never asked me if I. Malcolm looked at him and said, I should have known where the rainy place was. Jamie mentioned the green chairs and the big windows, and then you kissed her, even though she was dripping wet. Malcolm nodded slowly. Leo's cafe? It's still there, Jamie said. It's boarded up now, but I took a look. I think she might have left something behind, or maybe she was just here. They stayed close by, but didn't head out that night. They were soaked, tired, and just not in any condition to chase after anything. So there we were, talking about ghosts, and on the ride home, Jamie was up front while Caleb was in the back, totally out cold, snoring away. Back then, Malcolm found himself reminiscing about that cafe. It had been years since he last stopped by, and he wasn't sure why he hadn't gone back. Not even sure if it still had a roof. But the thought lingered. Maybe she had been there. Maybe she still was. Perhaps the spot where it all began was also where she left a part of herself behind. Hoping someone might actually care enough to come looking, they waited until the weekend. Jamie asked every day after school if it was it time yet? I wonder if she would really be there. Is it okay to bring the flowers, even though they're all ready? As Malcolm started to wilt, he did his best to keep expectations in check, but deep down, he knew better. We'll do what we can, he told Jamie. Better than lying. That was all he said. He wasn't sure if Elena would actually show up, or if she ever intended for them to find her. Maybe she had already moved on. Once more, they strolled by Leo's cafe, reflecting on whatever thread they had been unraveling these past few weeks on Saturday morning. Jamie grabbed a coffee and headed downtown early. He had the letter he'd written, all folded up nice and neat, tucked carefully in his jacket. He didn't say much in the car, maybe because Malcolm was getting closer to where they were headed. The boarded-up cafe, the less there was to say. The building sat at the end of a quiet little side street tucked away behind a hardware store and an old newsstand, which has turned into more of a pigeon nest these days. The cafe's windows were still covered with wood, and you could see some spots where the spray paint had been applied unevenly. But the frame of the door was still standing strong, but the green chairs had disappeared, leaving just the rusted legs behind. They stayed piled up against one wall, almost like they were just left there, and Jamie placed the flowers on the concrete next to the door. He noticed a patch of weeds growing through a crack, then stepped back and pulled out the letter, pausing for a moment before tucking it away. He glanced through the slats of the boarded window, then turned to Malcolm and shrugged, as if he was uncertain about what to do next. Malcolm didn't have an answer either. They stood in silence for a few minutes. The street was empty, just the occasional sound breaking the quiet. Malcolm checked his surroundings, listening to the hum of traffic nearby and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. They'd been there for almost an hour, and Jamie leaned against him. Maybe she's already left. Maybe I should have brought the map. Malcolm smiled faintly. I think she got it. They were just about to leave when someone called out from behind them. Jamie. They turned around, and there stood a woman a few steps away. Her feet were back near the alley, with the hood up and sleeves that were too long for her arms, wearing thin canvas shoes. She seemed older than Malcolm remembered, but not in the way he had anticipated. Definitely not frail or delicate, just a bit worn in. Her voice was softer than it used to be. Like she hadn't been using it much lately. Jamie froze for a moment, then dashed over to her, collided with her middle, wrapping her arms around him tightly. She dropped the small bag she was carrying and clung to him like she. Malcolm wasn't sure if it was real. He just stood there, arms hanging loose at his sides, watching. Her sides felt a bit tight as she glanced up at him, and he didn't mention her name. He didn't have to. She stepped forward slowly, still holding Jamie's hand. Malcolm spotted a scar near her wrist, a jagged white mark that seemed pretty fresh. She kept her gaze down as he noticed it. She stood in front of him. I saw the flowers yesterday, she said. And I came back today to see if you were hoping for me, Malcolm said. She nodded and glanced down at Jamie before looking back at Malcolm. Can we go somewhere? She asked if they could just talk. They found themselves in a cozy little cafe a few blocks away. There's one of those newer spots with chalkboard menus and an espresso machine that hisses every time it's used. Someone opened the door, and Jamie settled between them at the window, quietly sipping hot chocolate. Elena wrapped her her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched, and I was at a loss for how to return to the moment. She mentioned that eventually. She wasn't even sure if she should. Malcolm said you should have. I wasn't really myself after everything. I kept thinking I'd get back to normal. It would be better, and I planned to reach out. But every time I thought about it, I just felt. It felt small, like I had lost any right to call you. She nodded again, but didn't say anything. She gazed out the window for quite a while before she picked up the conversation again. So, I thought maybe a change would help with my divorce. I moved to a new city, hoping to hit the reset button. But nothing really clicked. It's been a tough journey. I had jobs coming in so quickly that I could barely keep up. Then I got sick for a bit, and there was a place that. I ended up at a shelter in another town after going through 4 other places. I was just waiting to figure things out, but time went by, and I still didn't have any answers. I started writing again, which was helpful, but I still didn't want anyone to see me like that. It's not you, it's not him, Jamie said suddenly, not looking at her. I miss you, Elena's voice trailed off. Her throat worked, but no words came out. She reached over and held his hand. Malcolm leaned forward and said he asked about you almost every day. I had no idea. What should I say to him? I really thought you were off somewhere far away, not right here. I was about to be. That was the plan, but something kept drawing me back. I'd stroll by familiar spots. I spotted a kid who reminded me of Jamie, and I even saw you once on Main Street. Malcolm blinked. You caught a glimpse of me, but then I was gone. She said, but I saw you. I almost said something. So, I hadn't slept at all, and honestly, I looked like a totally different person. It was like I felt like she was a different person when he didn't want to find broken. She glanced at him, then really took him in, and let out a small laugh. I keep going back to my journal. I've read it more than once. Jamie pulled something from it. He mentioned his jacket and another folded paper. You should come to my game, he said. I play soccer now? When Saturday rolls around, she glanced at Malcolm. That's okay, he nodded. Of course, I don't have much figured out yet, she said. I'm still working part-time at a library downtown, but I don't have a place yet. It's better, not perfect. Not all the way, but better. Come to the game, Jamie said again. Sure, I'll be there. They left the cafe together, but Elena decided to head off in a different direction. She mentioned she was walking around the corner, and Jamie wanted to tag along, but Malcolm said no. It felt like the right choice to let her go for now, to give her the space to come back when she was ready. As they drove home, Jamie sat quietly in the back. Malcolm watched him, humming to himself and gazing out the window, a calmness about him that had been missing for weeks. In the mirror, he felt something uncoil in his chest, a pressure that had been there for way too long, finally loosening just a bit. Maybe she wasn't really gone. Maybe this was Saturday kicked off with clear skies and a nice breeze that made the fields smell like freshly cut grass and sunscreen. Malcolm stood there, with the other parents along the sidelines, one hand in his pocket and the other casually holding a folding chair. Jamie was already out there, running warm-up drills and darting across the field. Malcolm, in his typical blend of excitement and a bit of disorder, checked his phone out of habit, not really thinking he'd find a message, but it vibrated right before the game kicked off. No words. Just a little nod from across the way. Elena stood a few feet away from the other parents, her hands tucked into. Her coat sleeves were a bit too straight, and her hair was pulled back. Nothing too fancy, but definitely neater than the last time they saw her. She had on jeans and scuffed sneakers, and no makeup. She looked just like herself. Not at all like the version Malcolm had been imagining for the past year. He strolled over slowly and pointed to the empty chair next to his. You made it. I mentioned I would. And they just sat there quietly for a few minutes, their eyes on the field. Parents looked over, and a few of them nudged each other. Elena noticed this. Malcolm didn't flinch. He cleared his throat and said, Don't worry, they'll find something else. Hey, did you hear? I think Linda's going to have her dog in a stroller again next week. What do you think? Elena let out a quiet laugh, but it was genuine, definitely more useful than most of those board meetings we used to have. They settled into a comfortable groove, tossing around comments about the game and cheering when Jamie had a breakaway, even though he missed the goal by a hair. 3 feet laughing when he tripped and popped right back up like it was all part of the show at halftime. Jamie ran over too. He grabbed a water bottle, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Elena, and his face lit up. He just grinned and took off back to the field, like everything had finally clicked into place. After the game, they strolled back to the car together, with Elena holding the. Jamie swung his bag over one shoulder, chatting away about the leftover orange slices without missing a beat. About the game, and how next time he'd definitely score. Malcolm hung back, letting them chat for the first time. For a long time, the walk didn't feel heavy. The weeks that followed moved slowly. But Elena began to show up more regularly. She met Jamie for ice cream and took. He goes to the library on Sundays and joins them for dinner once a week, sometimes. Malcolm made sure the boundaries were clear, not because he was against wanting more, but it just felt better this way, you know? Cleaner. Jamie asked fewer questions about the. Could Mom come to his school open house? What do you think? She wanted to be there for his birthday. Could she read him that story again? You know. The one with the sleepy giraffe? She always said yes to that. We didn't really chat much about the time when Malcolm asked a few careful questions at the start, just enough to get a grasp on things. There were gaps, but I didn't push when Elena breezed through the details. Some things were still a bit too vague. Wow, he didn't really need a whole story. He could just tell by the way she moved. The way she looked at Jamie, almost like she was savoring every moment, trying to soak it all in to make up for what she had missed. He didn't hold any resentment. He got it. One morning, a headline appeared in his email alerts that his ex-wife has resurfaced after her disappearance and has been spotted at the soccer game with a former billionaire. The photo was a bit grainy, but you could definitely tell who it was. Malcolm called his PR manager before he even finished his coffee. I want it gone, he said. They mentioned it's already making the rounds, so they need to get it buried. His team moved quickly, and by noon, it was done. The article was either removed or buried so deep under all the fluff pieces that it might as well have vanished when he. I mentioned to Elena that she seemed tired, but honestly, I wasn't surprised. I figured it would catch up to her eventually. They really don't deserve a piece of her energy. I used to think I had to explain myself to everyone, but now I realize I don't. He offered her somewhere to stay that afternoon, not out of guilt or charity, just because he. She smiled but shook her head, saying, I need to keep moving from place to place. You could tell how tiring it was for her. I want to find my footing on my own, she said. Just let me try it my way. He didn't argue. He knew better, but instead, he helped her find a part-time job at a bookstore cafe in a quiet corner of town. The kind of place. It was a place filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and the comforting aroma of paperbacks. She worked the register during the day and also ran the little story hour. On Tuesdays, she began jotting down notes again in the margins of her break schedule. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it gave her structure and purpose, you know? Malcolm. I noticed it in the way she stood up taller and how she stopped shying away from mirrors. Jamie. Elena often dropped by, usually with a backpack stuffed with schoolwork and a cookie bribe from the cafe counter. Some nights, after closing, Malcolm would stop by to help her restock. And she kept one of his drawings taped behind the register. The shelves were wiped down, and tables sat with her as she tallied the receipts, but they didn't add up. We didn't talk much. We just shared some tea and let the quiet settle in one evening after a particularly. It had been a long day. She sat across from him, her shoes kicked off and her hair tucked behind her ears. The shop was empty. The only sound was the hum of the cooler behind the counter. This is nice, she said. It is. They didn't touch. Lean in, no lingering glance. Just two people sitting in the middle of something unfinished and totally okay with it. We're still better as teammates, she said, and Malcolm nodded in agreement. Always were. She smiled and picked up her tea again. You were terrible at. So, you know how you mentioned being in charge every week? And you're still married, right? I shrugged, and you still said yes. Outside, the street lights flickered on. At some point along the way, a train went by while the shop remained quiet, just holding on. They didn't need to say anything more. The space between them felt just right. They took care of things and moved on. Malcolm left first, and Elena watched him go from the doorway with her arms crossed, holding the key. She had it in her hand when the doors closed behind her. With a calm steadiness, she locked it and then strolled through the shop. Once again, she flipped chairs onto tables, humming a lullaby softly under her breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She realized she had everything she thought she needed, but it was hers again, piece by piece. The writing unfolding. The workshop kicked off because one of the librarians at the community center where Elena volunteered had heard about her. She talked about her journal project and how she had started filling notebooks again after everything. Then, she asked if she'd be up for leading a. It's a short class, just once a week. Nothing too formal, with a few people from in the neighborhood. There were mostly women with stories they weren't quite sure how to share. Elena said yes before she even had a moment to think about it. I started to overthink it, and by the second week, the class had doubled. Now, it's almost been a year. Later on, she was running 2 sessions on Monday and Thursday evenings, and the wait list really caught everyone off guard. But Jamie loved to boast about how his mom taught people the art of bookmaking. She still worked part-time at the bookstore cafe, but the workshops provided her with something different: structure, yes, but also more. Her days had a nice rhythm, and her nights were mostly quiet. She had her own way of doing things. Imagine a second-floor apartment right above a bike repair shop, featuring windows that welcome in the morning light and a cozy little space. Jamie visited the desk, where she had a rotation of 3 pens, each a different color. Malcolm would often swing by on Sundays, whether it was to drop him off, pick him up, or just hang out for a bit. They would chat based on how their week had gone. The 3 of them had kind of settled into a routine, but it wasn't like going back to the way things used to be. It was something fresh, more balanced, and no one was really pushing too hard, you know? Malcolm, now that I'm semi-retired, I've moved away from the hectic boardroom life and transitioned to part-time consulting. At home, he had cut back on his schedule and stepped up his game as a dad. He didn't. He misses the chaos more than he expected. Those mornings with Jamie, evenings spent cooking simple dinners, and long walks together. As they wandered through their neighborhood, these things occupied their time in a way that quarterly earnings never could, and now here they were. On the morning of Jamie's 8th birthday, he was in the backyard hanging up paper lanterns with Elena. They were debating if they should add another balloon arch by the fence. I mean, it just looks a bit sad over there, one of them said. Left side, she said, balancing a piece of tape in one hand and a plastic streamer in the other. It's 8-year-olds. They're not really focused on looks. They just want cake and bounce houses. So they'll surely spot any crooked decorations. Malcolm shot her a glance and then grabbed another streamer. You're worse than his kindergarten teacher, he said. I'll take that as A. They're working together, checking things off the list, adjusting chairs, and arranging favors on the table. It's great to see them side by side like that. Malcolm had borrowed from a neighbor. It wasn't the first time Elena had been at the house since she came back, but today felt different. Everything seemed lighter and less tentative. There was a bit of hesitation in her movements, but there was no doubt about her place in the picture. The guests began to arrive around noon. It was a mix of Jamie's classmates, some neighbors, and a few of Malcolm's old friends. The food was definitely part of the scene in the backyard. It filled up fast with the sound of running feet and laughter. That cheerful noise that makes conversations overflow. Another day goes by, and it feels like nothing really gets wrapped up. The sun was warm, but it wasn't too harsh. So, someone kicked off a playlist while the kids were taking turns bouncing around in the inflatable obstacle course that Malcolm had rented. At the last minute, Jamie zipped between groups, all sticky from popsicle juice. He was wearing a paper crown and had a water balloon in each hand, looking like he was all set to declare war at any moment. Elena was standing by the table, refilling the lemonade pitchers when Jamie came running over and gave her a spontaneous hug around the waist. He stumbled back half a step and laughed. Best birthday ever, he said. You say, every year, right? I really mean it this time. Later. So, after the cake, the candles, and that last round of musical chairs, things got a bit heated with Caleb and a girl ending up in a tie that not everyone agreed on. So there was this person named Zoe, and someone passed Jamie a little plastic microphone. He gave it a quick tap, squeaked, "Can I say something?" The adults quieted down as Elena started to lift her. Jamie stopped to look around the yard, then glanced up while holding the phone to take a picture. His parents were standing together by the porch steps. "I just want to say thank you for coming," he said. "This is my best birthday ever. Not just because of the balloons or the bounce house, even though those were super fun. It's the best because I have both my parents again." There was a pause, not for effect. Just the kind of. There was this quiet moment that followed when something hit a bit harder than anyone thought it would. A few folks clapped, and someone let out a sniffle. Malcolm placed a hand on Jamie's shoulder and playfully ruffled his hair. Elena then stepped in and wrapped him in a tight hug. She held him just a second longer than necessary, and the party seemed to linger for a while after that as the kids gathered their goodie bags. Parents exchanged friendly smiles as the party wrapped up, making half-hearted promises to meet up again soon, while the yard slowly emptied. By the time the sun had set behind the rooftops, the place was empty, with just a few lanterns still hanging and swaying softly in the breeze. Malcolm and Elena were sitting on the porch, sipping their coffee. At first, they didn't say much, just enjoying the moment together. Caleb and I were out in the yard, catching fireflies, both of us barefoot and totally ignoring bedtime. He really meant it, Elena said finally, that speech. He did. You ever think we'd? How do I get here? Not like this, Malcolm said, but I'm glad we did. They sat for a moment. Just another minute of watching Jamie laugh and chase those glowing specks of light through the grass. Oh, and Elena's coffee? Yeah, it had gone cold, but she didn't care. I'm really proud of you, Malcolm said as she glanced over at him. I'm proud of all of us, he said with a nod. The porch creaked a bit as she leaned in. Back in her chair, Jamie ran up and showed her a jar with 3 fireflies softly blinking inside. She helped him. I mentioned poking holes in the lid and told him we'd need to let them go before bedtime. He was on board with that. But only after naming them did the sky grow darker and the jar glowed gently in between. They just sat together in the quiet for a long time. 3 points in A. The constellation that had somehow found its way back into alignment, not by returning to its original spot, but by coming together with each other. They were right there. In the hospital room, which felt warm and dimly lit with one large window cracked open just enough to let in the early evening breeze, a small bouquet of carnations sat there. On the windowsill next to a half-drunk bottle of ginger ale, the walls were that same off-white shade you see everywhere. The maternity wing had a personal touch. I noticed a folded cardigan on the visitor's chair and a stack of. There are some paperbacks resting on the tray table. And a cozy knit blanket is tucked next to a diaper bag that's already showing signs of being well-loved. Jamie stood by the bassinet, gently swaying as he cradled his newborn daughter. Her tiny face peeking out from the fold of her blanket, a soft pink blanket, and the door opened slowly as Elena stepped in with a bunch of fresh flowers clutched in her hands. Her grip tight enough to crinkle the stems. She paused a few steps in, not because she wasn't quite sure where to go, but in that moment, Jamie turned to her. His eyes looked tired, but he shined and motioned her closer. Mom, he said, meet Ellie. He moved carefully. He cradled the baby as if it were second nature, gently placing her in Elena's arms. Elena didn't say a word. She noticed every little detail, from the impossibly tiny fingers to the way Ellie. She wrinkled her nose at the change in temperature, feeling the slight weight of warmth and newness as she sat down slowly. As if the chair might disappear if she didn't move carefully enough, her eyes remained fixed on the baby's face. I never thought I'd actually see this, she said. You have no idea how long I've been waiting. I've been waiting for you. Jamie knelt down next to her, one hand resting on his knee. He didn't. There was no need for words. His smile spoke volumes. Malcolm stood by the window. With arms crossed loosely, they gazed out, pretending the view mattered. But deep down, it really didn't. So, it was just a parking lot and a loading dock, but he was really just buying time. He'd already been in the room for an hour, making offers. He was there to support, stepping back when necessary, pacing in small circles. When he heard Elena's voice catch, he turned and he let out a breath he didn't even know he was holding. She seemed at peace, in a way that felt deeper than just calm, like something that had been held in for decades finally let go. They stayed like that for a while, with Elena rocking gently. Jamie was gently watching as Malcolm eventually settled near the foot of the bed. They chatted about Ellie's name and how it came to be. Jamie and his wife picked it without a second thought. It just felt right, he said. It wasn't really up for discussion. Elena hadn't asked, but hearing it spoken out loud hit differently. There was something about her. The thought that her name would continue on, transforming into something fresh, something little and radiant. She leaned down and kissed Ellie, feeling open to the world. The baby stirred but didn't cry. The next afternoon, they all gathered at Jamie's house. The weather had surprisingly stayed warm for early spring. Malcolm was at the grill on the back deck, flipping skewers while half listening to Jamie chat with a neighbor about cars. Elena was inside, swaying with Ellie in her arms, humming a lullaby. It hadn't crossed her mind in decades. But it all came rushing back the moment she held the plates that Jamie's wife brought out. Someone poured some wine, and the conversation came and went, quiet and content, as Elena stepped in. She sat on the porch just before sunset, the baby asleep on her shoulder. Malcolm had put in that swing bench 2 summers back, and there we were, rocking gently. I had one hand on Ellie's head, making sure it stayed steady. Malcolm joined her a few minutes later, a glass of wine in hand, while the grill was cooling down and they both relaxed on the swing. He didn't sit too close behind him, but just close enough to share the moment they had. I watched the trees change color as the last bit of light faded. Birds glided across the sky in slow arcs, and I could hear a neighbor's dog. I heard a bark in the distance. She looks like Jamie, Malcolm said. Yeah, she really does. And her mom has the same chin too. She's lucky, Elena smiled. The kind that it didn't have to be wide to feel full. She is. They didn't really talk much after that, did they? The air was gentle, the world quiet, as the sky shifted from a soft orange. Jamie stepped outside, holding a small box wrapped in tissue paper. He handed it to Elena without a word. At first, she didn't say anything. She just gave him a look that was hard to pin down, somewhere between gratitude and a hint of affection, with all the weight of everything they'd been through to reach this moment. She opened it slowly. Inside was a leather-bound diary. She picked up the new one, the kind with a ribbon to mark the pages and an elastic loop to keep it closed. Her fingers glided over the cover. On the first page, in Jamie's handwriting, there was just a single line for Ellie. Elena closed the book and hugged it to her chest, glancing over at Jamie. She wanted to make sure her grandmother's story would always be remembered. Looking down at the sleeping baby in her arms, she said, "Then let's give her a beautiful one." Later that evening, with everyone gone home and the dishes all cleaned up, Elena found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the diary spread open in front of her, with a pen in her hand. She took her time with the first words. She just sat there, letting it all unfold. The quiet settled in, allowing her thoughts to organize themselves into something worth writing. She had shared so many stories before. The years have been a mix, some for herself and some for others, but this one just felt different. It wasn't really about pain or loss or even redemption. It was more about what happened next. It's all about how you keep coming back, showing up time and time again, until your life starts to feel like something truly valuable. So, she finally wrote, "Dear Ellie, once a long time ago, I got lost, not the. It's that feeling of loss where you're just not sure which direction to take. And it gets to the point where you can't even recognize your own footsteps anymore. I wasn't really sure if I'd ever find my way back, but I did, thanks to your dad. Thanks to those who never gave up on me, because of the stories and the pages and sunlight streaming through dusty windows. This is where my story starts. Yours will be different. And that's totally okay. But hey, if you ever feel a bit lost, just remember that you'll. Hey, just a reminder that sometimes even those who seem lost find their way back home." She closed the book and tied it up. She grabbed the ribbon and tucked it into her bag as the porch light flickered on outside. Down the hall, Jamie was softly singing as he rocked Ellie to sleep. Elena listened for a few more seconds and then got ready to start again. If you like this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel out. And if you're looking for more heartwarming and emotional stories like this one, just let me know. Hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any uploads. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to know what you think about this one. Thanks for tuning in, and I can't wait to catch you in the next story.